Hello everybody, I'm here today with Georg, who has recently just exited Smoothwall, where he delivered a 5.6 return to Tenzing, who backed him, and made that exit to an Australian listed business. Hello, how are you, Georg?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. And the reason why I've managed to grab you onto the couch, as it were, is to talk about a few questions, because your experience is very recent. This was your first CEO role within a private equity-backed business. In fact, your first CEO role. So I'd really be keen to sort of ask you to share some of those experiences. I'd like to start off with, how did you prepare for your first CEO position in a PE-backed software business, for those who don't know?
Yeah, it's a great question. I remember the months leading up to my beginning at Smoothwall and spending a lot of time thinking about what that transition would look like. And I knew that it would be very different from anything I'd done before. And there were a couple of books that I found very helpful, one of which I think lots of people have read, but it is so good, so I'll reference it anyway. So The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which is it's a really well-written business book with tight chapters where every chapter has a purpose. You know, it's not just one idea extrapolated for 300 pages. It's got practical appendices with advice as well for a CEO or a senior leader, but really often CEO. And the other one is one that I hadn't come across before, but I actually found very good, called The CEO Next Door. And I think there's a romantic novel by the same name, so it's not that one. It's a because I did recommend it to someone and they got completely the wrong idea. But there is another book called The CEO Next Door, which is very, very good, and it really talks about, you know, the early months and then over time and how you build a relationship with the board and you think about all the different stakeholders. So yeah, I sort of read through those things. I looked at all the last few months of board reports at the company, the investment memo that Tenzing had put together when they were investing in the business. And I spent a lot of time with our chair, Lisa Stone, and other board members as well, getting under the skin of the company. So I felt already on day one that I knew a lot about this organization and you know, who some of the key people were and what some of the challenges and opportunities might be. And I felt genuinely that going in on day one, I knew as much as the investors did. They had invested just a short number of months before I joined, and I felt, you know, that they had brought me right up to speed with their level of knowledge on day one. So it was a good starting point. There was lots more to learn from that day forward, but you know, we sort of started in the same place, which was great.
As an ad hoc, I'm going to throw out there, talk about books. I think in the book about the art of war, one of the things to talk about is preparing for war. So you sort of do all your research, get your first move, second move all prepared. But when you go in there and you finally go to the battlefield, you start, but you don't know what's going to be thrown at you, and all of that goes out the window. So question to you, after all that preparation, knowing that you knew probably as much as the investor and you went in there, how different was it really?
I think there was more work to do in more areas than I think any of us expected. And actually, the folks at Tenzing are quite kind of pragmatic and I think humble about that type of thing. They know that as investors, you know, even with all the due diligence that one does, you don't understand everything about a business until you really start to own it. And then, of course, it's the job of the operators like myself to dig even deeper and really sort of unpick and put it back together again. I think there was more work to do in systems than we expected, and we did in the end actually change every single system in the company.
Wow.
CRM, finance, HR, productivity, telephony, customer support, dev tools. The joke is that the only thing we didn't change was the vending machine. Although actually we did change that, we put healthier snacks in. But there was a tremendous amount of that kind of work to do, and I don't think we'd anticipated quite so much of that. And then I think also culturally, there was a little bit more work to do. It was a good business. It had great market share. It had been operated by the original founders for its first 17, 18 years of life. And it needed to be brought sort of up to date with modern management practices and cultural practices, and even little things like on day one I said that I wouldn't take the old CEO's enormous corner office, which he would walk into bypassing everyone else and then leave again at the end of the day, and people would sort of come and see the headmaster. And I said I wanted a desk in the middle of the office where people could see me and I could see them, and we could interact. And that already sort of was quite revolutionary. So there's lots of these things that we undertook, and the first 18 months was extremely fast-paced in terms of change.
That sounds amazing. One of the questions that I know people will be keen for me to ask is, in your previous positions, prior to obviously going in at Smoothwall as CEO, you've led the EMEA arm of US headquartered entities. What counsel would you provide to others in a similar position today, looking to step into the CEO role for the first time?
So I think it's to be prepared that it is a completely different experience in so many ways. And so, for example, whilst I was at Tesla, and I was responsible for Western Europe at Tesla, so I had a reasonably large team, over 300 people in 5 countries, 38 locations. But you're a regional director, you're not the CEO. And so, there's a certain degree of instruction that comes down from above, and there's a certain amount of shielding of some of the crazier elements of those types of things that you can do for your team and other things that you're driving them on. And they know that you are sort of a foot in each camp, a foot in the executive camp, a foot with them, kind of, they believe that you've got their interests, at heart. Now, when you're the CEO, the buck stops with you 100% completely. So everything that's going on in the organization, people assume people assume you've approved it, and that may or may not always be the case. But if things are not good and people are not happy, the buck stops absolutely with you. There is no higher power. It's it is therefore, I think, something that people sometimes call a lonely kind of role, and I think that's another big adjustment. If you are the EMEA head of you probably have peers. As a CEO, you don't have peers in the same way. You don't have someone inside the organization that you can go to and say, is this driving you crazy in the same way that it is me? Can we work on it together, and so on? So of course, you try and establish those things as part of the executive team, and you try and establish a version of that with your board. But there's an hourglass shape to this, right? The organization's looking up at the CEO, and the board is looking at the CEO, and he or she is sort of in the eye of the storm. And I think that's quite different. I think also you are responsible for all the corporate functions and all of the bits that you weren't previously responsible for. So, I had, I think, a roughly annualized $1 billion worth of revenue flowing through the organization I was running, but I did not own manufacturing. Right? The products arrived in Europe from California. And so, suddenly you find yourself responsible for product and engineering, as well as finance and operations and all of those bits and pieces. Yammer was a little different there because we did have developers in Europe, but again, they were also reporting to our global CTO. And so we had to create a culture in our European office that brought developers and salespeople and customer facing and marketing people all together. But when you are the CEO and it all rolls up to you and you've got to make those balancing decisions about resource allocation, that's a very different role to being a regional director.
There's probably a lot of investment directors out there that would agree with that sentiment, because whenever we get asked to find somebody who's a CEO with previous PE experience and not just somebody from corporate, that's probably just encapsulated all the learnings that they're talking about. Just while we were talking about Tesla and Yammer, another thought popped into my head. Some would say certain private equity houses are pivoting towards growth equity investors, and by consequence drawing parallels with VC investors. Your time at Tesla and Yammer was very similar to that high growth experience. What sort of insight can you bring in now, reflecting back from that high growth role into the role you've just done, what are the parallels there?
So for the listeners that don't know the background of Yammer in particular, so it was a venture capital backed organization. At the time I joined, they'd raised a Series A and B, and then during my time at Yammer, we raised Series C and D, and were then acquired by Microsoft. Tesla, of course, is a listed organization, but really unlike any other, very high pace, very intense, led by this enigmatic genius engineer CEO who did drive the organization really very, very hard. And so those environments, venture, public listed, and now in private equity, they're of course different in a number of respects. But I do think the time at both Yammer and Tesla were very good for me in coming into this role from that point of view of intensity and pace. So I think private equity, does expect its leaders to drive change and to be action oriented. Of course, to take the appropriate time to analyze and understand, but then they are looking for action. And I think actually, there was really no better business preparation for that than some time spent at Tesla, which is extremely action oriented. I think also where it's perhaps a little different is around goal setting. So, when you're in the venture world or Tesla, the goals were always, well done on what you achieved last quarter. Now we're going to 4x. Now we're going to 4x. Like everything just has to be enormously higher. And you didn't always hit those goals. The point was to shoot for the moon and kind of get close or either a bit over or a bit under, but always shoot for the moon. That was something I did have to learn to moderate a little bit in the private equity environment, where actually, of course, the advice you get given is to make sure you set targets that you're going to just moderately overachieve, so you're always beating expectations, and just being a little bit more conscious of lower risk tolerance and a greater premium placed on certainty and good kind of confidence in what's going to be coming next. So that was a little different. And then I think maybe the last difference is in Tesla in particular, there was very, very high focus on operations detail and I mean that defined very broadly, from sales operations to retail operations to logistics and customer service operations and so on. So it was a case of really being very deep in the weeds and being able to zoom in and out very constantly, to the point where I once walked a service, the storage area in the back of one of our service centers, and we were looking at how quickly we were turning parts around. And the trick that I was taught was to run your fingers across the shelf and see how much dust you pick up, because if there's no dust, then we're turning the parts over quickly. So, as a leader, to be very sort of walk the line in terms of mindset. In the private equity world, what I've seen is there's a similar level of detail orientation from the finance perspective, and then typically less in some of the operations perspective, and that's where they expect operators like myself to pick that up.
Thank you. That's a very, very interesting answer. One of the other things that leads me on to, Georg, is you've just done this stint within the PE-backed environment, and while it's all still fresh in your mind, I'd love to understand what you think have been the most significant learnings that you've had as a CEO. And if somebody was sitting here listening to you, what advice would you pass on and say, this is what I did, and these are like the lessons that I've learned, and this is what I would tell, looking back at me, the naive version of me, having been through what I've been through, this is what I would tell him or her. What would that be?
Yeah, I've spent some time reflecting on that, and I think the first thing is that bias towards action and making change is something which I've really had to think very, very hard about, because there was a period early on where I was probably too intense, driving too high a pace. And one of the things that I did at that time, which was good, I suppose, was to get some coaching. And one of the things my coach, who is brilliant, did for me was a really detailed 360. And out of that, and we spent, I think I got sort of 30 or 40 slides of sort of detailed feedback. And out of that, I learned with her help that I needed to develop multiple operating styles. Yammer and Tesla had sort of one mode, which was foot to the floor, all the time. And I think I needed to develop, she put it, multiple golf clubs in the golf bag, and playing the right, well, I'm not a golfer, as you can probably tell, but using the right style for the situation and the person in front of you and developing some of that. So I think that is worth considering. There's certainly not one cookie cutter sort of mode. I think also, looking back, I would have probably still driven the same rate of change, but just done it in a slightly different way. And that's despite the fact that when I do look back, there were mistakes that we made along the way, some of which were really quite painful and took some time to, you know, recover from. But actually, when you zoom right back out and you think over the 3.5-year sort of period from my joining in May 2018 to our exit in August 2021, for a fantastic return, you know, actually, if we had not gone as fast as we did early on, I don't think we'd have been ready for COVID, and I don't think we'd have been ready for building back sort of, oh God, I nearly said build back better. But anyway, building back more strongly out of COVID as we did. And you know, a fantastic result in the end, and actually one in which our acquiring company and ours are working incredibly closely together, because we've so much to learn from each other, because we did a lot of this foundational work early on. So I think you have to be prepared to forgive yourself when you make mistakes, and just be very take onto yourself that there must be a learning from each one. You know, even if sometimes that loneliness drives you to think, you know, why is everyone not on the same page as me, or why haven't we achieved what we wanted to achieve? And so you just take it on yourself. There's a learning from everything, and then you know, just keep moving forward. I think also I would overinvest in a couple of areas. I would overinvest in finance. I think we got there in the end, but we I think with hindsight, we would have invested more heavily in our finance function earlier on in the holding period. And in the end, we built a fantastic team, but it maybe took us too long to recognize everything that we needed to do there. And I would invest in customer success. And that was a big, significant sort of transformation of the business and reorganization of some existing teams, creation of some new roles, putting in some new fantastic technology that allowed us to get real-time customer health scoring, and then the building of a culture all around that of continuous customer success management. That was the single best project we ever did during my time at Smoothwall. And I would, you know, I'd probably have, with hindsight, started that sooner, which which would have required, I think, some A, systems work to have happened, and also B, some real confidence in driving a significant transformation of the business. So in my first 18 months as CEO, you know, so busy with all the systems work, and then and then COVID, and then the last year, you know, really bull by the horns, driving the business changes through. So some of that I might have done earlier. But yeah, it's someone once said to me, as a parent, the best advice they could give me was to learn to forgive yourself. And I think as a CEO, that's not bad advice as well.
Very wise words indeed. Being a parent myself, I forgive myself constantly. The other question I'd really love to delve into is this fantastic exit you've been through. So a 5.6 return for Tenzin, great. Any lessons learned through the sales process for other CEOs and investors out there? I mean, this was your first, so it'd be great if you could share your insight.
Yeah. I've got pages of notes on this, actually, that I sort of wrote down in the days after we completed, and so to try and condense it right down, I'd say key ingredients of our success. We picked a really good bankers, and worked very closely with them. I don't think they'll mind me saying Raymond James were our banking partners. So Laura Madison and Joe Donnelly and Sergey, you know, just phenomenal team. I think, and I will hold my hands up and say I was a little skeptical of the role of bankers, and they absolutely proved what really good bankers can do, because they worked tirelessly with us on crafting my second point, which is really around the story. And then in maintaining my third point, which was around competitive tension. So we had a really good story, but we did need some help in order to pull it all together and explain it in a way that would appeal to a broad base of different investors. And then as we narrowed down the field, to help to translate what was going on. You know, as I was going through this process, everything was a learning moment, and they were explaining, you know, some of the second, third order things that were going on and the phases of due diligence. And, you know, I worked very closely with Laura to develop a lot of trust around sort of message discipline. And then that allowed me to build up a really strong relationship and have kind of narrative confidence in that relationship with our prospective buyers, CEOs, and develop a personal connection with each of them, but one that was both playing with a very straight bat, but also was supportive of the key messages at the key moments in order to keep the process just sort of moving along. I think in the business we had some great characteristics. We had strong market share, we had a cash cow product, we had a high growth area, and a team with a lot of strength and depth in terms of experience. But and some other things that were useful were recent track record of acquisitions, and we've done 2 small ones, one medium-sized one, and demonstrated that we had some kind of good ideas and experience of bringing those things together. So all of those things sort of added up, but you know, really strong story, great orchestration, which was important, and then the maintenance of that competitive tension, really until the very, very last minute. So those are kind of the key points.
Thank you, Georg. Just off the back of that, have you also reflected on the process to think about, you know, future exits that you do, you know, later on in your career, what you would do differently?
Yeah, I think the one that really springs to mind is just to not try to run before we could walk. And I think we did a little bit of that early on. So we sort of made a decision as a board that this was the right moment to initiate a sale process. And I think we tried to accelerate out of the blocks very, very quickly. We had already been talking for some time on and off with Raymond James, but we brought them in, and they then helped us kind of realize that actually we weren't quite ready yet. We needed to do a little bit more work. But by that time, I had already, you know, reached out to a number of prospective buyers and started some conversations with them. So I found myself you know, talking to them about why it was taking a little bit longer and we weren't quite ready yet, but you know, just treading water a little bit. So that we sort of unnecessarily created a little bit of a sort of false start, if you like, in our process. You know, with hindsight, I'm an optimist, so every cloud silver lining. Maybe it helped in some of the relationship building that I was doing with those people. And I think in the end, that relationship at the key moments throughout the process was very important. And if I didn't underline that enough, I think I should make sure to underline it now, that I think the key people on each side, and it's not just the CEO, is something that as the presentations go on, then you have the executive team and potentially some of the wider management folks as well come on and represent themselves, so that the acquiring company or the acquiring investment house knows that it's not just, you know, sort of single individual, that there's this wider team. It's very, very important. But yes, that relationship, to be able to just sort of pick up the phone or exchange some WhatsApps at key moments, is super important. So I think timing is something I would have done a little bit differently. You know, it was incredibly hard work. It was exhausting. You know, I got COVID at the very end of it, and I think thankfully my wife is a corporate tax lawyer. She understands this sort of world very, very well, and therefore was extremely supportive, and I owe her a huge debt for that. But you know, you've got to prepare sort of friends and family that they will not see much of you for a period of time, and that there's a toll that comes with that. So I would also say book a good holiday for the end of it.
Wise words indeed, wise words, I think. And they always do say behind every successful man there's even more successful women. So hats off to your wife on that one. Another question that comes to mind is people often discuss the differences between a generalist and a thematic investor. Tenzing are clearly the latter. What personal insights can you share from an investor steeped in history when it comes to investing in software or tech-enabled assets?
I think what they're trying to do is build learning, build their experience set of learnings across their different investments, and then help to translate those from investment to investment. And so, one of the things I hope to be able to do is to share some of my exit learnings with some of the other portfolio CEOs in the Tenzing portfolio, just to kind of give back into that group in a way that I also learned from others along the way. So I think that's one thing. I think they've also got some central teams. They've got an entrepreneurs panel. They've got a central sort of M&A type function, a couple of folks who actually go out and help scout the markets for potential targets and do a lot of the early work for the management team so that they don't have to do that, or a lot of the process work along the way. So actually in 2 out of 3 of our acquisitions, that was very, very helpful. So I think Tenzing have been able to build a body of knowledge and experience and learnings in themselves and across the portfolio companies that supports what they're all trying to achieve. And then I think also they, a tech business is different from a manufacturing or a retail business, and they are, and so one has to understand what those differences are and what to lean into, and where to sort of really follow something through, and what kind of bets can be foundational in order to see growth down the line. And I think they've just done a really good job of finding the companies where some of those opportunities are not yet completely realized, and knowing where to help and where to get out of the way. And they're very good at that balance as well. So there were moments with us where they were extremely hands-on, and moments with us where they just said, like, what do you need from us? And my answer was, I need to talk to you slightly less often for the next period of time. And they said, that's fine. Like, let us know when you need us, kind of thing. So it was just a good and I think, if I could say a thing about them for a moment, which I really appreciated, but they're very bright people with a high degree of empathy and low ego, and that's not always the case in private equity. And I think it's something that we really appreciated, was it created a very comfortable environment around the board table where we could genuinely talk openly about successes and failures, and and make sure that we were all owning each of those things as we should.
Yeah, thank you. Another quick question that comes to mind is probably my penultimate question, is what permanent changes do you think COVID has led to how the business operates now?
Well, so Smoothwall is a company that provides safeguarding solutions and software, predominantly into education environments, so schools by and large. And so I think there's a difference that COVID has made to our customer base, and there's a difference to how we run the business. So in the customer base, everyone's experienced remote learning. There are lots more devices in schools now, and even as students are going back into schools, there's still more and more hybrid learning and more tech-enabled learning than there has ever been before. I think that the acceleration in adoption of technologies in schools has been very dramatic, and teachers that weren't comfortable with teaching over Teams and Zoom and so on in the past have become comfortable with it. And so that opens up a lot of opportunity. But the more digital or the more time children spend in a digital environment, obviously that also creates the opportunity for more harm to occur through that digital environment, and that's what Smoothwall helps with. And so there's been, I think, never more need for solutions like ours than there is today. And then, as part of Family Zone, the coming together of those two businesses, Family Zone have an even wider vision, which is to protect every child's digital journey, which then has implications for where and when children access technology, not just in the school environment, and what one could do there. And again, you can just see the sort of risk for children growing into the future. So that's one impact that was accelerated by COVID. And then in terms of running the business, we went wholly remote a week before the government required us to, in March 2020, and we've been wholly remote ever since. So we will close down our main office. We will go into a hybrid way of working, but kind of extreme hybrid. So whereas I think a lot of companies are doing 2 or 3 days in the office, we're going to have a much smaller footprint office with a sort of clubhouse feel, very collaborative, very sort of friendly, and entirely optional as to whether or not people want to go there. And each team will choose for themselves on what frequency they'd like to get together as a team. So I've said to them, that might be weekly, it might be fortnightly, it might be monthly. That's your choice as a team, what makes sense for you in terms of a team get together. And otherwise, the office is just there for people if they want, a break from working at home, or they want to gather around a whiteboard in a small group, or to meet in person, because they'd like to go to the pub after work, whatever. So a very, very different way of operating the company. And we found it, in our case, to be very effective. And we hope with that sort of extreme hybrid model that will still retain some of the positive elements of having people together. But even then, we've been able to hire some fantastic talent in remote locations around the UK and internationally in countries outside of the UK, because we committed so strongly to remote working. And so there will still be some colleagues that we won't see on a weekly basis, and that will be fine. So we've embraced it. We're kind of enjoying it very much.
So my final question, Georg, is, if I may, is in this world now, post-COVID, I think economies are trying to return to some form of normality, and there's a lot of growth actually happening in tech. If you were to try to predict the future, where do you think are the big growth opportunities in tech?
It's a fascinating question, and I think the first thing I'd say is that I think there are opportunities in tech everywhere. I think that we're only going to continue to see an acceleration in fantastic innovation, and you see that in biotech, you see that in sort of Web 3.0, or distributed finance. You see it in like the real world applications of blockchain as those start to come out and it starts to actually mean something to people. I think we'll continue to see great innovation in transport, in financial services as well. I think there's a tremendous amount of money to be made in fintech. I think there are vast swathes of society globally that are not yet well served with many of the things that we take for granted in countries like the UK. I think if you look at technical literacy, if you look at the amount of funding and finance that's available, if you look at the appetite of generations coming through school and university and just the other side now for entrepreneurship, I don't think it's ever been better. I think there's a very competitive landscape for talent. And we're competing in the UK and in America with China and the rise of sort of tech talent and enormous funds coming out of Asia. But there are also enormous markets there, which if you can find the right opportunities to tap into them, are very, very exciting. Like I was talking to one entrepreneur who's running a fintech in India at the moment in a completely unserved section of the market that has 300 million people in it. And you just think, wow, what's that, 4 or 5 times the size of the UK, and it's just sort of a third of the Indian population. So I'm very optimistic. I'm always optimistic about these things, and I think that the hard part is actually in all the many tens of thousands of businesses that are being started is to find the right ones, because there will still be lots of ones that don't make it along the way. But there will be, I think I was listening to a podcast the other day talking about a unicorn company in tech being created more than once a day over the last 12 months, which is, if that statistic is correct, is just bonkers.
It's amazing. The growth and the pace of growth is just astounding. Georg, thank you very much for your time. It's been a genuine pleasure speaking to you, as always. And I look forward to seeing what the future holds.
Thank you, Ruby. It was fun. Thanks for having me on.